In the high summer of 1983, when the fifth consecutive month without meaningful rain had baked the topsoil of Garrison County into a single cracked ceramic plate, Elias Thorne's last productive well went dry. The pump coughed up a final gallon of rust-colored sludge at 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, then began to suck air with a hollow, terminal groan. A month later, on a day when the heat shimmered so intensely it seemed to bend the light itself, his 80 lop-eared pigs, the ones the whole county pitied him for, found him a pond that had been buried for nearly a century. This is the story of how they did it. Let me tell you about Garrison County because you have to understand the place to understand the pressure. It wasn't just dry. It was existentially dry. The county sits on 744 square miles of rolling prairie in the rain shadow of a modest mountain range that locals called the Blue Sisters. It was land settled not for its generosity but for its availability. The Homestead Act of 1862 had populated it with Swedes, Germans, and Irishmen who understood hardship as a baseline condition of life. They measured rainfall not in inches but in fractions of inches, and they spoke of past droughts the way other cultures spoke of ancient wars. There was the Dust Bowl of the 30s, which had depopulated 3 entire townships. There was the flash drought of '54, which had killed 10,000 head of cattle in 6 weeks. And now there was the Great Scorch of 1983. By August, the official rainfall deficit at the county seat was 147 inches. The Barren Fork River, which normally required a 30-foot bridge to cross, was a ribbon of cracked mud you could step over. Of the 281 family farms that had started the year, 64 had already sold out to the agricultural conglomerates from the east, the ones with corporate names and access to capital markets Elias couldn't even imagine. The price of alfalfa hay had gone from $80 a ton to $325 a ton, and you had to have it trucked in from 3 states away. The sound of Garrison County that summer was the sound of well pumps drawing air and the low, mournful bellow of thirsty cattle. Elias Thorne was 68 years old and had been working this specific 420-acre parcel of land since he was old enough to walk behind his father. He was a third-generation farmer on this soil. His grandfather, Elias Thorne, had bought the original quarter section in 1889 for $250 an acre from the railroad, paying for it with 3 years of labor laying track. Silas had built the barn in 1903 with timber he felled himself, and the pegs holding the beams together were the same pegs today. Elias's father, John, had added another 260 acres during the Depression, buying out a neighbor for 10 cents on the dollar and a promise to let the family stay on in their house for as long as they lived. They stayed until 1962. Elias had inherited the whole operation in 1971, along with his father's debts, his grandfather's hand-drawn map of the property, and a profound, bone-deep skepticism of anything that promised an easy solution. He was a quiet man, known for 2 things: the worn leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket, where he recorded weather patterns, crop yields, and animal behavior in a tiny, precise script, and his habit of tasting the soil. Before planting, he'd walk his fields, crumbling a clod of dirt on his tongue, judging its mineral content and moisture with a focus that made outsiders uncomfortable. He was 5'9", with the stooped shoulders of a man who had lifted too many heavy things for too many years. He wore gray twill work shirts and blue jeans, held up by a plain leather belt his father had given him in 1948. His face was a roadmap of his life, deeply lined by sun and worry. And then there were the pigs. Let me tell you about the pigs, because they were at the heart of the county's pity. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1981, Elias had sold off his entire herd of modern, efficient Yorkshire-Hampshire crosses. They were the standard breed, the ones that grew fast and lean on formulated feed. They were predictable, profitable, and entirely dependent on the systems that supported them. Automated waterers, climate-controlled farrowing houses, and a steady supply of corn and soy. Elias sold all 300 of them. With the money, which amounted to $45,000, he drove 1,200 miles to a small heritage farm in the hills of Tennessee and spent $32,000 on 80 breeding pigs of a nearly forgotten line called the Cumberland Blue Spot. They were, by every modern metric, terrible pigs. They were thick with fat, slow to mature, and possessed of long, floppy ears that covered their eyes and gave them a perpetually bewildered look. They were foragers, not feed converters. They were designed by centuries of hard living to range over woods and pasture, to dig for roots and mast, to survive on what the land offered. To his neighbors, who farmed with spreadsheets and futures markets, it was an act of profound, almost willful foolishness, an investment in nostalgia. Bill Satterfield, who farmed the 2,000 acres to his west, had stopped his truck by the fence line one day. Bill was 45, had a degree in agribusiness from the state university, and drove a brand-new John Deere 4440. He watched the blue spots rooting around in Elias's pasture for a long time. Finally, he shook his head. "Elias, what in God's name are you doing with those things? They went out of style with the horse and plow." Elias just shielded his eyes and looked at his new herd. "They're good mothers," he said, "and they know how to find their own water." Bill had just laughed. A short, sharp bark that wasn't unkind, just incredulous. "There's no water to find, Elias. Not anymore." He got back in his air-conditioned cab and drove away, kicking up a plume of dust that settled over everything. For 2 years, the county watched and pitted. Elias's pigs took 10 months to reach market weight, while Bill Satterfield's took 6. Elias's pork was dark and marbled with the kind of fat the market had been trained to reject. He wasn't getting rich. He was just getting by. But his input costs were a fraction of his neighbors'. His pigs required very little corn because they spent their days grazing in a 40-acre pasture Elias had planted with a complex mix of clover, chicory, and deep-rooted grasses. They were, in their own slow, inefficient way, self-sufficient. They were a closed system, and then the rain stopped. The drought began quietly in the spring of '83. A dry March, an unseasonably warm April. By June, the farm ponds were shrinking, their edges receding daily, leaving cracked, polygonal plates of dried mud. Elias had 3 wells on his 420 acres. The first to go was the shallowest, a 90-foot well his grandfather had hand-dug in 1905 to water the house and garden. It went dry on June 12th. The second was the main irrigation well, a 250-foot bore drilled in 1962 that watered his 100 acres of corn. The flow rate dropped from 40 gallons a minute to 5, then to a trickle, then to nothing on July 21st. His corn, which had been his primary cash crop, withered on the stalk, the leaves turning a brittle, papery brown. The crop was a total loss, a $70,000 write-off. His last source of water was the livestock well, drilled in 1947 to a depth of 320 feet. It fed the troughs for his small herd of 30 beef cattle and the drinkers for his 80 pigs. It was this well that gave out on that Tuesday in August. The silence that followed the pump's final groan was louder than any noise he had ever heard. It was the sound of the end. That afternoon, his grandson, Thomas, arrived. Thomas was 19, home for the summer from his first year at the same state university Bill Satterfield had attended. He was studying hydrology and modern farm management. He was a good kid, but he was full of the unshakable confidence that comes from a year of university education. He saw his grandfather's farm not as a legacy, but as an inefficient operation in desperate need of optimization. He loved his grandfather, but he loved the idea of progress more. "Grandpa," he said, his voice earnest, "we have to call the state. They have geologists, consultants. They can survey the property, find the deep aquifer. We can't just give up." Elias was sitting at the kitchen table, a solid oak table his grandfather had made. In front of him was the old, hand-drawn map of the farm, its paper yellowed and soft as cloth. It was a beautiful thing, drawn with an architect's precision but annotated with a farmer's observations. Elias Thorne had marked every rise and fall, every patch of good soil and bad, every tree that was old in his time, and he had made notes in the margins. "Good spring clay here," one read. "Bedrock shallow," said another. Elias ran a finger over a section in the far northwest corner of the property. A 60-acre pasture marked North Hollow. It was poor land, never cultivated. The soil was heavy clay, and it sloped down into a shallow basin. His grandfather had drawn a small, strange symbol there, a circle with 3 wavy lines inside it, and had written a single, cryptic phrase next to it. Where the hogs sleep in summer, the earth weeps in winter. The state expert arrived 2 days later. His name was Dale Jepson. He was 35 years old, had worked for the State Water Survey for a decade, and was known for his almost perfect record of finding water. He drove a state-issued Ford F-150 with a decal of the university's logo on the door. He was tall, thin, and wore crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt, which seemed wildly out of place in the dust and heat. He was polite, professional, and radiated an aura of data-driven certainty. He shook Elias's hand firmly. "Mr. Thorne, I understand you're in a difficult situation. Let's see what the science can tell us." For 2 days, Dale and his assistant used their equipment to survey the 420 acres. They had a portable seismic thumper that sent shockwaves into the ground, and a ground-penetrating radar unit that they pulled back and forth across the fields in precise, grid-like patterns. The data fed into a ruggedized laptop in the cab of his truck, slowly building a three-dimensional map of the geology beneath the farm. Thomas followed Dale everywhere, fascinated, asking questions about hydraulic conductivity and fracture tracing. Elias watched from a distance, saying nothing. On the 3rd day, Dale called Elias and Thomas over to his truck. He turned the laptop screen towards them. The screen showed a complex, color-coded diagram of the subterranean world. "Here's the situation," Dale said, pointing to a deep blue layer on the chart. "The Ogallala Aquifer is down there, but on your property it's at about 800 feet. Too deep to be economical, but you have a perched aquifer here." He pointed to a smaller, greenish formation. "It's a pocket of water sitting on a layer of impermeable shale at about 450 feet. It's not huge, but my models show it's being recharged from the west. It should be reliable." He zoomed in on a specific point on the map, a spot in Elias's main hayfield, about 300 yards from the barn. "This is your spot, right here. The geology is favorable. I'm 95% confident you'll hit a good vein of water there." "How much water?" Elias asked. His voice was raspy from the dust. "I project a flow rate of at least 15 gallons a minute. More than enough to keep your livestock going and even irrigate a small garden." Thomas was beaming. "See, Grandpa? Science. It's the answer." Dale Jepson closed the laptop. "The cost to drill to 450 feet with casing will be significant. I've spoken with Miller and Sons Drilling. They can be here Monday. They charge $41 a foot. With the pump and everything else, you'll be looking at around $18,500. The number hung in the hot, still air. It was every last cent of Elias's credit at the Garrison County Bank. It was the farm itself. He would be betting everything on that green smudge on Dale Jepson's computer screen. Elias was quiet for a long time. He looked from Dale's confident face to his grandson's hopeful one. Then he looked out toward the North Hollow, where his 80 pitted pigs were lying in the shade of the few scrub oaks that grew there. Finally, he unfolded his great-grandfather's map and laid it on the hood of the truck. He pointed to the symbol, the circle with the 3 wavy lines. "What about here?" he asked. Dale Jepson leaned over. He squinted at the old map, a polite, tolerant smile on his face. "North Hollow? Mr. Thorne, my seismic data shows that's the worst possible place to drill. It's a syncline, a geological depression filled with about 200 feet of impermeable bentonite clay. It's a bowl. Any water that falls there just sits on the surface and evaporates. Drilling there would be like drilling into a pottery kiln. You'd hit nothing but dry clay all the way down to the shale." "But my grandfather marked the spot," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. He wrote, "Where the hogs sleep in summer, the earth weeps in winter." He knew this land. Dale's smile became a little tighter. "I'm sure he did, Mr. Thorne, and I respect that. That's valuable folklore. But what I have here is data. Billions of data points fed into advanced hydrogeological models. It's the difference between an old folk song and a satellite image. One is beautiful, the other is useful for navigation." He tapped his finger on the screen of his closed laptop. "The data is clear. Your best and frankly only shot is in the hayfield." The conversation that night at the oak kitchen table was the most difficult Elias had ever had with his grandson. "Grandpa, you have to listen to him," Thomas pleaded. "This isn't 1900. We have technology. We have science. That map is a family heirloom. I get it. But it's not a geological survey. Dale Jepson is an expert. He's the best there is. We're out of water. The cattle are already showing signs of heat stress. We can't afford to make a mistake based on a riddle." "It's not a riddle," Elias said. "It's an observation. My grandfather watched this land for 50 years. He watched how the snow melted in the spring. He watched where the fog settled on cool mornings. He watched where the animals went when it was hot. That's data too, Thomas. It's just collected over a longer period of time." "But it's anecdotal." Thomas's voice rose with frustration. "It's one man's observation versus a computer model built on decades of research. We have to drill in the hayfield. It's the only logical choice." The next morning, Elias Thorne called the bank and extended his line of credit to its absolute limit. Then he called Miller and Sons Drilling and told them to come on Monday. He had bet the farm on Dale Jepson's science. The drilling rig arrived at dawn. It was a massive, intimidating machine, and its presence felt like an invasion. The Miller brothers, both men in their 50s who had known Elias their whole lives, set up over the small red flag Dale Jepson had planted in the hayfield. The sound of the drill biting into the dry earth was a brutal, grinding roar that echoed across the silent, drought-stricken landscape. Neighbors gathered at the fence lines to watch. Bill Satterfield was there. So were a dozen other farmers, their faces grim. They were all in the same boat. If Elias Thorne could find water, maybe there was hope for them, too. Dale Jepson stood by, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a calm, professional air. Thomas stood next to him, his face a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Elias stood apart, by the barn, his old map in his hand. He watched the drill rig, but his gaze kept drifting to the North Hollow. "Let me tell you about drilling a well because it is an act of violent, expensive faith. For 2 days, the rig hammered and chewed its way into the earth. At 100 feet, they hit packed sand. 200 feet, gravel. At 350 feet, they hit a thin layer of sandstone. Each new depth was announced by the drill operator, his voice cutting through the engine's roar. Dale Jepson would nod, checking the drill cuttings against his projected geological chart. Everything was proceeding exactly as his model had predicted. On the 3rd day, at a depth of 442 feet, the drill bit broke through the shale layer. This was the moment of truth. This was where the perched aquifer, the green smudge on Dale's screen, was supposed to be. The drill operator cut the engine. A profound silence fell over the farm, broken only by the chirping of cicadas. Everyone leaned in. The operator lowered a weighted line down the borehole. He let it sit for a full minute. Then he began to pull it up, hand over hand. Everyone watched the line, looking for the telltale darkening of moisture. Came up bone dry. "Try again," Dale said, his voice a little tight. "Maybe the fractures are tight. We need to set a charge to open them up." They spent another $2,000 on a small explosive charge, which they lowered down the hole. The resulting thud was a dull, subterranean cough. They waited an hour. They lowered the line again. Came up as dry as the first time. They had drilled a 450-foot hole into the ground, at a cost of $18,450, and had hit nothing but dust. The failure was absolute and public. The neighbors drifted away from the fence lines, their shoulders slumped, their own silent fears confirmed. The Miller brothers packed up their rig, their faces full of sympathy. They told Elias they'd wait for payment, but he knew, and they knew, that was a promise he might never be able to keep. Dale Jepson was stunned. He kept looking at his charts, then at the dry borehole, then back at his charts. "It doesn't make sense," he kept muttering. The model was perfect. The data was unequivocal. Should have been here. He packed his equipment into his truck. Before he left, he walked over to Elias. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his professional confidence shattered. I am truly sorry. I don't understand what went wrong." Elias just nodded. He looked at Thomas, whose face was pale with the shock of seeing scientific certainty crumble into dust. The boy looked like his whole world had been upended. The days that followed were the worst. The heat wave intensified. The temperature hit 104, then 105, then 107. The farm was dying. Elias was hauling water in 250-gallon tanks from the town, at a cost of $150 per tank, just to keep his animals alive. He could afford to do that for maybe another week. The bank called. The feed supplier called. The end was no longer a possibility. It was a schedule. He began to make preparations to sell the cattle. The pigs would have to go next. On the morning of the 5th day after the well failed, Elias Thorne woke before dawn. He walked out to the porch and sat, watching the sky slowly lighten in the east. He had failed. He had failed his father and his grandfather. He had listened to the confident outsider, to the voice of the modern world, and it had led him to ruin. His own intuition, the quiet wisdom inherited from his grandfather, he had ignored. He had one last desperate, foolish idea. An act of faith not in science but in history, and in the instincts of an animal the world had deemed obsolete. He walked to the barn and took down a pair of heavy wire cutters. He went to the North Hollow, to the 60-acre pasture that hadn't been grazed in 70 years. The gate was wired shut, rusted solid. He cut the wire. The gate groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved since before he was born. Then he walked to the pig pasture and opened that gate, too. His 80 Cumberland blue spots, drawn by the novelty of an open gate, trotted out. They were thirsty and hot. They moved as a single unit, their big, floppy ears bouncing, their snouts to the ground. They ignored the parched fields and headed directly, unerringly, toward the North Hollow. Elias didn't herd them. He didn't call to them. He just followed, with Thomas walking silently beside him. Let me tell you about that pasture. The North Hollow was different from the rest of the farm. The grass was sparse, but there were strange, deep-rooted plants that were still green despite the drought. The ground was uneven, pocked with shallow depressions. Felt older, wilder. The pigs fanned out, their snouts working constantly, reading the ground in a language no human understood. They weren't just looking for food. They were searching for something else. For coolness. For moisture. For a memory encoded in their DNA. For an hour they roamed. Elias and Thomas watched. The sun rose higher, beating down on them. Then a big sow, the matriarch of the herd, stopped in the lowest part of the hollow. She began to root, not with the casual snuffling of a foraging pig, but with a frantic, focused intensity. She dug her snout deep into the baked clay, grunting with effort. Within minutes, 3 or 4 other pigs joined her. They worked together, their powerful neck muscles tearing at the hard-packed earth. They weren't digging for truffles. They were excavating. Elias walked over. The spot where they were digging was no different from the ground around it, not to his eyes, but to the pigs it was a beacon. He knelt down and put his hand on the clay they had exposed. It was cool. Not cold, not wet, but distinctly cool to the touch. "Get the shovels," he said to Thomas. They brought back 2 old shovels from the barn. The pigs moved aside, watching them with intelligent, curious eyes. Elias drove his shovel into the ground. The top 6 inches were like concrete. He had to stomp on the blade with his boot to break through. Beneath that was a thick, dense gray clay. It was damp, not muddy, but holding a faint, residual moisture, like a well-wrung sponge. For 2 hours they dug. It was brutal work under the relentless sun. They opened a hole 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The clay grew damper the farther down they went. It began to stick to their shovels in heavy, wet clumps. The air in the bottom of the hole smelled of wet earth and ancient rain. And then, at a depth of about 4 feet, something changed. Elias's shovel broke through the clay layer into something softer. It was a dark, almost black soil, rich with decayed organic matter. Felt alive. He scooped out a shovelful. As he lifted it, a tiny trickle of water, no thicker than a pencil lead, ran down the blade of the shovel and dripped onto his boot. Thomas stopped digging, his mouth open. "Did you see that?" Elias didn't answer. He dug again, deeper into the black soil. This time, when he pulled the shovel out, a small pool of water, the size of his hand, immediately seeped into the depression he had made. The pigs, who had been watching from the edge of the hole, began to crowd in, grunting with excitement. They kept digging. With every shovelful, the seepage grew stronger. It wasn't a gusher. It wasn't the dramatic eruption of a Hollywood oil strike. It was a quiet, persistent, steady welling up from below. The black soil was acting like a filter, and underneath it, the water table, pushed down by the drought but still present, was pushing back against the pressure of the atmosphere for the first time in decades. The earth beneath their shovels gave way, and the water began to rise. They climbed out of the hole and stood watching, their chests heaving, covered in mud and sweat. The water, clear and cold, rose steadily. It filled the bottom of the hole, then climbed the sides. Within an hour, they had a puddle 3 feet across. By noon, it was a pool 10 feet across and a foot deep. The pigs waded in, drinking deeply, then laying down in the cool water, grunting with what sounded like pure, unadulterated joy. By evening, the pool had stabilized. It was about 20 feet in diameter and nearly 3 feet deep in the center, fed by the constant gentle pressure from below. It wasn't an aquifer Dale Jepson could model. It was a high spring, a natural cistern created by the bowl-like formation of the clay that Dale had so confidently dismissed. The clay didn't block the water. It held it. It was a buried pond, a natural reservoir that had been collecting and holding water for centuries, its existence known only to the deep memory of the land, the faded ink on an old map, and the primal instincts of 80 lop-eared pigs. The news spread the way news does in a small town, not like a wildfire, but like water seeping through dry ground, quietly and into every corner. The next day, Bill Satterfield's truck appeared at the edge of the North Hollow. He got out and just stood there for a long time, watching the pigs wallowing in their new pond. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head slowly, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. A few days later, Dale Jepson returned. He didn't come in his official state truck, but in his personal car. He had his testing equipment with him. He was humbled, his scientific certainty replaced by a quiet curiosity. He took water samples and soil cores. He walked the perimeter of the hollow, his brow furrowed in thought. "How did you know?" he finally asked Elias. "My data, my models. They all said this was impossible. This formation should be dry." Elias was sitting on an overturned bucket watching his pigs. "My great-grandfather didn't have radar, Mr. Jepson. He had pigs. He watched them. In the heat of summer, this is where they came to lie down because the ground was cool. He figured that if it was cool on top, there must be water underneath. In the winter, when the ground was frozen everywhere else, the snow would melt here first. The earth was weeping, he called it. He just paid attention to things that your models don't measure." Dale was quiet for a long time. He looked at the pigs, then at the pond, then at the old man watching them. He was a scientist. He was trained to believe in data. But the evidence in front of him was irrefutable. "It seems," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that I need a new model." The aftermath was quiet, but profound. The pond, which the family came to call Hog Wallow Spring, became the permanent water source for the Thorne farm. It never ran dry. Even in subsequent droughts, it held steady, a reliable, life-giving heart in the center of their land. The farm survived. Not only did it survive, it adapted. Elias and Thomas used the water not to grow vast fields of thirsty corn, but to nurture their pastures, making their foraging pigs even more self-sufficient. They kept the small herd of cattle, but the pigs became the soul of the operation. Thomas never finished his degree in hydrology. He came home after that summer and stayed. He learned to read his great-grandfather's map not as a relic, but as a living document. He learned to watch the animals, to taste the soil, to read the weather in the clouds instead of on a screen. He didn't abandon science, he integrated it. He used modern soil testing to improve his pasture mix and veterinary science to keep his herd healthy. But he made his most important decisions based on the slow, patient, accumulated wisdom that had been passed down to him. When Elias passed away in 1995 at the age of 80, Thomas was 31 years old and was known throughout the county as a man who understood the land in a way no university could teach. He still kept a breeding herd of 80 Cumberland blue spots. They were no longer a symbol of pity, but of resilience. Of the 64 farms that sold out in the drought of '83, none ever returned to family ownership. They were absorbed, consolidated, and run by managers from offices 1,000 miles away. Bill Satterfield held on for another decade, drilling 2 more expensive, data-driven wells, before finally giving up in the drought of '96. His 2,000 acres were eventually planted with a single variety of genetically modified soybean, a monoculture desert dependent on inputs trucked in from elsewhere. The world is full of confident experts and sophisticated models that can predict everything except what matters most. They can measure the soil, but they cannot measure its history. They can model the geology, but they cannot model the memory of the animals who have lived on it for generations. What survives in the end is not always the strongest or the fastest or the most efficient. What survives is what is most deeply connected to the place it inhabits. The knowledge that matters is not always the knowledge that can be quantified and put on a chart, but the knowledge that is lived, observed, and passed down in stories on old maps and in the profound, unspoken wisdom of the earth itself. It wasn't the pig's fat or their slow growth that was their true value. It was their memory. They were an insurance policy written not in a contract, but in the language of instinct. And when all the other systems failed, it was the only policy that paid out.